Hello, my name is Christi Dalton, and I will be doing a screencast over two different eras of poetry in education. My two books are the American Poetry, and it was adapted in 1923, and my other book will be the Houghton Mifflin Reading Indiana Teacher's Core Reader Guide, and this was adapted in 2007. My first book was by A.B. D. Mill. When I first opened the book, what I found interesting was that there are pictures throughout all the poems and infographics that are in this book. They go along with the poems, with the authors, anything to provide details to the students about what they are learning about. The next part of the book goes into the introduction, and it provides information about the study of poetry. Here's where students will learn about rhythm, meter. You have the variations, the different type of figurative languages, along with information about what a sonnet is. Here is my first interesting find. What I discovered was that the previous owner created his own line and practiced the material on his own. And this was my other interesting find. Here, the student put an H above slips and put hips above lips. I believe that this was in the rhyming section of the book. Here are two examples of the different type of sonnets that were introduced to students. You have one that was by Wordsworth and another one by Shakespeare. This was the last part of the book. It has explanatory notes. This is where students will be able to learn about the poets, when they were born, where they were from, when they died, along with information broken into chunks of each poem. It breaks down the poem so students are able to understand it better. This was my other interesting find. Frank wrote his name several times throughout the book. And this was my very first find. Frank had drawn himself on a piece of paper and tucked it away into his textbook. My next book will be the Indiana Core Reader Guide. The theme for this one is 4, and its focus would be on problem solvers and poetry. And this teacher's edition is designed to teach 4th grade. This would be what the poetry section would look like. What I found different about this guide versus the 1923 guide would be that in 1923, students were learning about poems that were popular, and in 2007, students were being introduced to poems that were appropriate for their age level. Here, students will be taught how to write a poem, along with main selections in poetry, along with background and genre vocabulary. This is an example about the instructional support that teachers are able to have in this book. Most schools will have the Indiana Teacher's Edition and practice book. The materials off to the right are materials all schools are able to buy extra if needed. What I found interesting about this book is that it provides worksheets and reading materials that are designed to meet the different levels of reading. You have the below, on, above, and those that need language support. There are also suggestions for independent reading. Here would be the lesson plan that is laid out for this section. This is common in the Core Reader Guide. Students would be introduced to genre vocabulary, which would be beats, imagery, lines, examples like that. There would be woodwork, where students are working on phonics and decoding. And in the written and oral language section is where students will learn how to write poems. They will start with pre-writing a poem, drafting a poem, and then they will be revising, proofreading, and publishing one. And throughout the grammar selection, students will be working on adjectives, similes, and metaphors. Here is a section that discusses how teachers are able to manage flexible groups. You have the whole class instruction and the small group instructions. And this is just what it will look like continued on. This will be an example about what teachers will see in their core reader guide. It introduces the poem, and then it will ask comprehension questions, fluency modeling, and building background information. For building background information, the teacher will introduce students to the idea that they will be reading a number of poems in this section, and they will also be learning about the elements of poetry and try writing a poem of their own. A comprehension question would be that we are to ask our students how a poem is different from a story. What do I believe poetry will be like in the future? My 2 books were 2007 minus 1923, and that is an 84-year gap. So 2018 plus 84 equals 2102. Poetry in the year 2102. The 22nd century. Poetry is scarce now in 2018. I believe that it may not be taught in 2102. The reason I believe this is because you see it less being instructed in elementary classrooms, but it's becoming popular in the higher levels of education in high school. If poetry is taught in the future, it will most likely be focused in the writing section of academics instead of reading. The reason I believe this would be because when writing poetry, it involves a lot of brainstorming, and brainstorming is highly focused on the academic testings. I believe that textbooks will not be produced in 2102. Students will be provided with microchips that will be used as their textbook or some form of technology that is easily transported.